everyone to begin. Yes? Okay. Begin?
Yes.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to this evening's presentation about navigating test optional college admissions. And of course, it's like, to be or not to be, to test, to not test, to submit, to not submit. We've been gathering an awful lot of data to share with you this evening, and hopefully it will clarify more than confuse. So we are recording this, so you'll be able to, replay it or share it with friends. It's on both Facebook Live and YouTube Live. There are a number of links that you can get from our website, from SCORE Webinars, for some interesting downloads that would go along with this particular webinar. There's an awful lot of data that I just don't have the time to share this evening. So the very first download, the application surge graphics, it actually shows an awful, just data from a previous presentation I did that we didn't want to repeat very much of it in here. But anyway, lots of other good information for you to download. So this evening's presentation, we're going to try to answer a number of questions for you, all about whether or not you should be taking, the SAT or the ACT, not necessarily which one, but whether you should be taking the test. When does it make sense to apply test optional? When does it make sense to really, submit your scores? And, what do colleges look at if you're not submitting scores? How do they evaluate differently without scores than with scores? So leaving 2021, which was sort of a banner year in college admission, and going into the class of 2022. Truly, this last year saw an unprecedented spike in admission competitiveness. I think admissions gets more competitive every year, mainly at the more selective universities, but relatively across the board. More anxiety, kids applying to more colleges, more students getting top grades, more students wanting to go to college. So we do see, admissions creeping up, getting a little bit more competitive, pretty much every year. However, last year saw unprecedented increases. And in fact, if I go back 30 years ago, the most competitive universities out there had a 17% admit rate. Now, the most competitive universities have only roughly a 3.5% admit rate. That's a very significant difference over the years. So, what happened? I mean, why, these application numbers surged. Colleges could not accept any more students than they, normally would. So therefore, the percent accepted went down, which made the colleges, much more competitive. And myriad kids who were at the top of their class, were denied admission at colleges that just a year or two before would have gladly, eagerly accepted them. And instead of talking about colleges that were highly selective last year, a colleague coined the term highly rejective, and that has come to characterize many of our nation's top tier universities. So there were lots more, rejections, deferrals, wait lists than we had ever seen before, and definitely fewer students than, submitted test scores this past year than the year before. We saw, I think, perhaps better decisions, more decisions, let me say, for under-resourced students, underrepresented minorities, first generation students. Many colleges use test optional in order to diversify their class further, and you'll see why, in a moment. And because of the anxiety that was produced by the uncertainness, let me say, that was produced by COVID-19, colleges were filling larger and larger portions of their classes through early decision, and early action. And students who had gapped the year before, who decided to take a year off from college because they didn't want to go, virtually, were taking up seats from kids from, who were just starting freshman year, which also made it more competitive. That wasn't true necessarily across the board, but yes, at certain colleges that was true. But at the other end of the spectrum, at a smaller, less selective university, admissions seemed to be a bit easier. So that was sort of, the good news here. So overall, I would really describe this as just being a seismic impact on college admissions. It's like nothing any of us in this industry had ever seen before. And I think that, it stirred up many debates over test scores, equity, and those debates are, clearly continuing this year. But one thing that is for sure for this current crop of seniors, they will face the brunt of a great deal of uncertainty. Many of us feel that the admissions will be as over the top, as competitive as they were last year, basically, because of test optional. So just looking at a little bit of the research that was done, and this research was done by Common App, which is our nation's, well, not just the nation's, but I'd say almost probably the world's leading provider of college applications. There's over 900 universities that accept the Common App. Almost any university you could name in this country. There's just, a few well-known universities that are not on Common App, but pretty much all the Ivy Leagues, most of your flagship state universities, your highly selective and not so selective liberal arts colleges. I mean, there's a huge range of colleges that are on the Common App, including 11 of our 12 state universities here in Florida, the exception being FIU. Anyway, you can see the number of applications that were submitted last year versus this past year. And that was an 11% increase, which is pretty significant because normally it's nowhere near that high. And some of our more selective universities saw as much as a 20 or 30% increase. Some actually one, Colgate, I believe, saw 100% increase in the number of applications. If you want more information on, the actual data from last year, we do have a webinar that I did a few months ago that's on YouTube that really goes into lots of detail about what happened last year. This webinar tonight is going to be, I think, more about looking forward, learning the lessons from last year. So right now, more than half, in fact, almost 2/3 of all the four-year colleges in this country are test optional or test blind. And in fact, it's about 1,700 colleges, and that's this year. So when we look at the kids who submitted scores last year, because after all, tonight's webinar is about test optional, last year, Common App reported that only 43% of all of the applicants submitted scores, whereas the year before, it was a whopping 77%. Remember, for many, many years, there have been a lot of colleges that have been test optional, but COVID-19 forced the hand of many colleges, and they did transition to test optional. But this is a decline of 44%. There were specific patterns in terms of, who was reporting test scores. And what we were seeing is that the applicants who were coming from much more, let's say, well-resourced areas, from affluent families, and also in the South and the Midwest, they seem to be the kids who were submitting the most test scores. So especially if it was a double whammy, like in the South, let's say here in Florida, and coming from an affluent family, an affluent community, you are much more likely to submit your test scores. And the lowest reporting rate came from the first generation students, underrepresented minorities, and communities of much lower level income. And I guess much of this is not surprising. So many students actually drove hundreds of miles, flew out of state to get to testing centers that were open because those by their homes were not. And so, yes, those are the more affluent. But overall, kids from wealthier communities were submitting. Kids from less wealthy communities, were not submitting in as high numbers. And breaking it down a little bit further, and again, this all comes from Common App. In fact, they just a few days ago released some additional research, which is where I've gotten these numbers, in terms of students who reported scores to every college to which they applied. And there were only 19% of students who felt that they scored, let's say, well enough to share their scores, or perhaps didn't know whether to share or not, so they did. But that was just 19% who shared their scores with every college to which they applied on Common App. At the opposite end of the spectrum, 57% of the kids who applied through Common App shared no scores whatsoever. And about a quarter of the kids, and this is really pretty interesting, did something that is now being called differential test score reporting, so that they picked which colleges they were going to send scores to. And you're going to find that some of my advice tonight is actually going to be figuring out which of your colleges you should be sending your scores to and which ones you should not. And that's assuming that you've made the decision to actually take the SAT. But the other interesting thing is that there were actually 200,000 more students this year who practiced this differential test score reporting than the previous year. So the other piece of the story that we learned from Common App is that, and this I guess shouldn't surprise us, that the more selective colleges actually more often received scores than the less selective colleges. So students were, trying hard to be as competitive as possible. And so the more selective, perhaps, the more scores they got. And this is a graph directly from the Common App, the research that was just done to show the rate of reporting from the previous year to this past year, and to show that there was like an extreme difference in terms of how many scores were actually reported, or how many students reported scores to a particular college from one year to the next. So, what does test optional mean? Because I think that there's some misunderstanding about it. Some people seem, to feel that test optional means, okay, well, test scores don't matter. You don't have to submit them, and colleges don't really care about them. So that's actually not true. That's actually the definition of test blind. A newer phrase that's appearing is test free. So if you are applying to a college that is test blind or test free, they truly do not care about scores. They are not going to look at them. You can send all the scores you want. They will be completely ignored. So, for example, the whole University of California system with its 9 state universities right now is test blind. That doesn't mean it will be that way in the future, because they are planning on hopefully replacing SAT and ACT at some point with their own tests that they think will do a better job. But test optional basically means that it's your option. You make the decision whether to send a score or not, because colleges are de-emphasizing their use. But that means that if you submit them, they're definitely going to be counted in your evaluation. And if you don't submit them, well, that's one less data point. They're going to have to find a way to evaluate you without those scores. But keep in mind that test optional and test blind are two, very different things. And that when it comes to test optional, the test scores will still play a pretty significant role in admissions, as you'll see as I start to present some more data. So about a year ago, NACAC put out a pledge for colleges to sign that says, hey, test optional means test optional. We're not going to hold it against you in any way. Not for scholarships, not for honors programs, not for competitive majors. We really mean that it is completely optional. Well, the interesting thing is 567 colleges signed the pledge. That sounds like a lot, except that is maybe a third of the colleges that are test optional. So what does that say about those that didn't sign the pledge? You can draw your own conclusions, but they weren't willing to commit to the fact that test optional really does mean test optional. So when a school goes test optional, admission does get more competitive. And that's because more students are encouraged to apply. In other words, let's say that I was going to apply to Boston University a few years ago, and I had maybe 1,000 on my SAT. And I knew that the students who got into Boston University perhaps were scoring much closer to about 1,300. So I would probably feel, why take a chance? I don't want to waste an application. I don't want to spend the money on the application fee. I don't want to do their extra essays. I just didn't apply because I thought I probably could not get in with my scores. Well, that barrier has been removed because Boston University is test optional because of COVID. And therefore, if I've got grades that I think are pretty commensurate with what BU is looking for, which is probably about, let's say 3.6, 3.7, and that's unweighted, and I have really a lousy score, I'm going to apply because I just might get in. So you're finding that more and more kids are filing applications because they feel that their academic records and other parts of their file are strong enough that they can apply without scores. But of course, without scores, it means that there is much more emphasis on everything else. Instead of having, let's say, 10 data points, we now have 9. And I'm just guessing at that number 10. And of course, what we've lost was definitely one of the most significant data points that carried a fair amount of weight. So again, you as a student are going to make a decision whether to submit or not, but it's not always as clear cut. I'm going to try to give you some guidelines for when to submit and when not, but there's definitely some exceptions. However, before COVID-19, when we looked at the data that was available from colleges, and I'll specifically mention the University of Chicago because they are one of the earliest schools to have gone test optional. That was a really highly selective university. When we looked at their data, there were far more kids who submitted scores than didn't submit scores. And the admit rate for those who had submitted was generally higher than the admit rate for the students who did not submit. And that sort of makes sense if you think about it in the sense that if I have high scores, I'm going to submit. And there's a better chance that I also have high academics if I have high scores. Similarly, if I have pretty low scores, there's probably a better chance that I'm not as strong of a student. And for most kids, their test scores are somewhat in line with their academics. And yes, there are definitely exceptions. Kids who are academic slackers, late bloomers, who have wonderful scores, but not so wonderful grades, and vice versa. If you're eager to know which colleges are test optional, there is a wonderful test optional list on fairtest.org. It is updated continually, and you'll get the latest data on the names of the colleges that are test optional, that are test free, that are test flexible. There are a lot of, it's like buying an airline ticket. There are a lot of different phrases out there to describe a college's testing requirement. So there are many students who believe that great grades are all I need to apply test optional. In other words, if I've got just a phenomenal academic record, that's going to carry me. So I can tell you that nothing could be further from the truth. It goes way beyond just your academic record, because there are so many kids today who have straight A averages. I'm sorry that the data that was available only goes through 2016, but you can see the trend. This is basically the percentage of high school students who had an A or an A minus or an A plus average. And so, back in the ice ages when I went to school, it was in the range of, say, 10 to 15% of us had A's. Going back, only 5 years to 2016, more than half the class has an A average. And so that number today is definitely going to be higher than 55%. How high is it? Don't know, 60, 65 perhaps. But it basically says that your grades are not going to be enough to distinguish you. So who's more likely, or or who's, let's sort of this way, who's sort of less likely to benefit from test optional? So you're not likely to benefit. If you come from a very well-resourced school, well-resourced family, colleges will tend to expect you to submit scores. If you've got plenty of opportunities to take the SAT, at the beginning of COVID, look throughout, say Broward County, Dade County, much of Palm Beach County, it wasn't convenient to take a test because all the test centers were closed. And many of the students who I work with in South America couldn't take a test at all because there just were no testing sites. So, that needs to be taken into consideration. A student who's got a weaker academic record is very unlikely to benefit from test optional because college will be expecting a stronger record. And a student who doesn't have a lot of extracurriculars to sort of make up for no test scores is not going to benefit from test optional. So these are just a few examples of the types of students who are generally not going to benefit at all from test optional because it's different expectations for them. But who will benefit from test optional if I don't submit a score? Hey, if I'm full pay, well, I already have a slightly better chance of getting into some colleges, many colleges, if I'm full pay. And if I'm an underrepresented minority student, colleges want me. Colleges are trying to diversify. So I could benefit from test optional if I don't do well on an SAT. And if I know I have enough other great stuff to present, not just great grades, but I have taken all the right courses, I've really challenged myself, I have some wonderful extracurriculars, perhaps with some solid leadership and real depth of commitment, I've got enough good stuff that I possibly can get in, or maybe better than possibly get in without sending my scores. Or if I've really bounced back from some setbacks, some trauma, some obstacle, and I've got this really amazing story of my resilience, I'm probably going to benefit also from test optional. This year, recruited athletes will benefit from test optional because the NCAA has not made test scores a requirement for initial eligibility. And I think the jury is still out on legacies, whether a legacy at a university, in other words, if mom or dad is a graduate of a particular university, if I apply test optional, will I see a benefit? I think so, but honestly, there's no data to know that for sure. But, we've just talked about, the kinds of students who might benefit or not benefit. Think about this for a moment before I show you the answer. Who do you think really benefits from test optional? Got your answer? Okay, let's see if this is a surprise. It's the colleges that benefit from test optional. Absolutely. They are getting far more applications when they are test optional. So almost every application represents revenue. You're paying an application fee. And of course, the more applications I get, the more selective I look, because after all, I probably did not add, more residence halls, more beds, more classroom space. So if I've doubled the number of applications, I'm not going to double the number of students who I'm accepting. I'm still going to accept pretty much the same number. So the percentage I've admitted has gone way down. That is going to impact my ranking as a college in U.S. News and World Report. And I will be talking about that a little later, especially because the rankings actually just came out Monday. Yeah, just came out yesterday. But when I become much more selective, my ranking is going to get better and better. And I might move from number 28 to number 21. And certainly my prestige also increases. So I think colleges are actually enjoying saying how many, bragging about, NYU got 100,000 applications last year. No private university in this country has ever gotten anywhere near 100,000 applications. Little Colgate University, a wonderful smaller university, upstate New York, got double the number of applications. So colleges are, I think, enjoying these bragging rights. But, many of you are here in Florida where I am, and our 12 state universities are remaining requiring tests. They did that last year. They were, I believe, the only state university system excuse me, that required test scores. And that's still in place this year. So if you want to go to any one of our 12 state universities, you must submit scores. And the same thing goes for Bright Futures, which is the scholarship that we have for in-state students who are going to universities here in the state of Florida. And our next door neighbor at Georgia, although last year they were test optional, this year the entire state university system in Georgia is requiring test scores. And so that includes pretty prestigious Georgia Tech and University of Georgia. So I'm going to move into the next portion of the presentation and start presenting some data. I wish I had a tome of data to share with you, but colleges have not been completely transparent in terms of giving us actual statistics about the percentage of accepted kids who submitted scores versus the percentage of accepted kids who did not submit scores. But I do have data from those colleges that were, that shared their data. It's not all from highly selective. These universities go from, I believe, a low admit rate of about 8 or 9% to the highest admit rate in the list that I'm going to share with you is, I believe, 58%. So yes, it's a selective school because they're, accepting a little bit more than half, but it certainly doesn't fall into the, sort of the highly selective. So what I'm going to show you next really reflects, let's say, selective and highly selective universities, but, just a range, anyway, of schools. So I'll start with Jeff Selingo, who's a very well-known college admissions author. And last year he did quite a bit of research. And he was, I think, one of the most outspoken who came out and said that kids with test scores are getting in more often, and sometimes their admit rate is twice as high if they had scores. He also found in his research that students who were applying to much more competitive majors, STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and business programs, it seemed to matter more if you were applying for a competitive program that you have test scores, and especially, having, say, great command of mathematics. So this is not from, Jeff's data. This is additional data that we found in combing the admission statistics for, dozens upon dozens of colleges, and came up with this handful of colleges. In red, I've used red to indicate a student did not submit, and green to indicate that a student did submit. So you can see, with one exception, with George Washington University, for every one of these universities, the percentage accepted among the submitters was definitely higher. Was it because they were better students? That's probably a high likelihood. There's no data yet to show that. I do want to bring special attention to George Washington because it's the one that's different than everyone else, except that George Washington actually went test optional before COVID. So it's not like this was a brand new policy that all of a sudden lots of additional kids took advantage of it. GW has been test optional. This is sort of another way of looking at that same data, and you can see sort of across the board, just with one exception of GW, in every case, the green line of submitters is higher than the red line of non-submitters, and the blue line that's in the middle is the overall rate. So again, for this handful of colleges, with the exception of George Washington, test optional beforehand, it seems to be less difficult to get in with test scores. And in fact, if you look at the ratio of students accepted with or without test scores, you can see what the advantage is. For example, at Emory, Georgia Tech, and Colgate, and actually UVA and Penn early decision, you were pretty much twice, let's even throw in UGA, University of Georgia, through their early action program. You were pretty much twice as likely to get in if you had test scores. Now, I don't want you to use that as cause and effect. Like, having the test score will automatically double my chances. Again, there's a very good chance that students with test scores might have had stronger academic records, stronger extracurricular, maybe better teacher recommendations. But I think it's really interesting that there is that much advantage to applying with scores than without scores. So a really key question for you is, hey, are my scores going to strengthen or weaken my application? So if your scores are above the median for that college, it can only help. And if you have much weaker scores sort of below their typical range, it might distract from everything else. But there are exceptions. So although we, in our private practice, tell students that, if a college, let's use easy numbers, if a college's range is, let's say, 1,100 to 1,300, the midpoint of that range, and that's the mid 50% range, the midpoint is 1,200. So if I am, 1,200 or above, I want to submit. If I'm under 1,100, I probably don't want to submit. And perhaps somewhere in between that 11 and 1,200, I need to really think about whether or not to submit. So some exceptions to rules like this would be, I'd say, if you're a student who benefits from test optional, in other words, if you are a student who's coming from an under-resourced school, or you're an underrepresented minority, or you're first generation, I think that you can submit with slightly lower scores. So you don't have to be above the median. You should be pretty close to the range. You can even be close to the bottom of the range. But I think there are just a lot of other extenuating factors. It's not always a clear-cut decision about whether or not you should submit. And you may ask, well, how am I going to find out what the college's range is? So there are a couple of ways, and one of them is directly from Common App, that if you are on your dashboard and you click on a college's name, and sort of another screen opens up, and it's got lots of information about that college. Its address, its phone number, its deadlines. But there's one line that has 3 different links on it, and the third link says College Navigator. And College Navigator gets data on every college through it's part of the federal government. Colleges have to report there. So if you were to click on College Navigator, and then it's going to bring up its data for the college you were on. So let's just say I was on the University of Arizona, for example. It will bring up lots of data for University of Arizona. I can click on admissions, and within admissions, I can see the mid 50% range for SAT, for ACT. Now, these were the students who enrolled, not who were accepted. These are the students who enrolled not last year, but I believe it's the year before. I believe that the government database is sort of not representing the current year, representing like the year before. That's going to at least give me an easy way to get some barometer of, do I think I'm in range? Yes, you can get much more up-to-date and accurate data on some colleges' websites, because some of them will indicate their freshman profile, either of their students who were accepted for the current freshman class, or their students who enrolled in the current freshman class. And the other thing is that you can go to U.S. News and World Report. It's not for the ranking so much as going for one source of looking up SAT and ACT mid 50% ranges. Although they are saying these are the best colleges for 2022, they don't reflect the students who are currently freshmen. I believe they reflect the kids who were freshmen a year ago and who enrolled as freshmen. So I believe it might be the same data that's on College Navigator. I don't know for sure. I haven't gone in there to check number for number, but there are a few ways that you can find out what is sort of a typical range. And if you are anywhere within that range. And of course, if you have AP, IB, ACE scores, and they're high, in other words, for instance, on an AP, that it's definitely a 4 or a 5 if you're applying to a highly selective or highly rejective school, a 3 if you're applying to, say, a moderately selective school, you definitely want to share those. And we think that colleges may actually wind up putting a little bit more emphasis this year on things like AP, IB, Cambridge scores. And there is room in Common App for you to indicate which future AP, IB, Cambridge, tests you're planning to take. So you should absolutely share great scores and all your future testing plans. So I thought it might be helpful to give an example. And again, remember that there are nuances, that just because I say yes or no, the decision may be different based on the student's ethnicity, academic record, socioeconomic status. But if I've got an ACT, for example, of 32 and I'm applying to Penn, think about whether you would submit that score and just assume that, for example, you're, a student who comes from a pretty well-resourced high school. You're coming from a comfortable family. You're not an underrepresented minority. Typically, would you send a 32 to Penn? So my answer is no. But again, if you have something else really strong going for you or unusual, then maybe the answer is yes. Dartmouth, which has only a mildly lower range, I'm sort of leaning towards not submitting a 32 to Dartmouth because I'm at the very bottom. With Emory, because I'm just into the range, I'm sort of leaning on yes. It may depend upon my academic record. With Tulane, because I'm, pretty much the middle, I'm definitely going to submit. Miami, I'm at the top, I'm going to submit. Syracuse, I'm well over the top, so I would submit there. Let's look at it from the SAT perspective. So I've got an 1150, a score that's really well above average. I'm applying to Drexel. In the past, Drexel wasn't ultra competitive. It certainly has become much more competitive. I'm below their range. I'm probably not going to submit to Drexel. I'm at the very bottom, just kissing that range for Elon, which has become more competitive. I probably will not send it to Elon, but I'm definitely going to send it to Loyola in New Orleans because I feel that, hey, I am right smack in the middle with my 1150. Similarly with Ole Miss, I'm above the middle. University of Alabama, well, if I were an Alabama resident, I might submit it, but if not, although I'm nicely into the range, that range goes all the way up to 1340. Might depend upon what my major was. Certainly if I'm a STEM major, I'm not going to send my 1150. And University of Denver, I'm not going to submit there either because I'm below the range. But again, please keep in mind that these answers are not firm. There are always exceptions. And I wanted to give you an idea of what you might see on Common App. And I find some of this a little disturbing, especially when you see the next screen. So they're pretty much explaining, hey, it's up to you whether you want to submit or not. And they are actually making it a little easier for you because they're telling you what their range is. So I think that's great when they're saying, hey, we're 1140 to 1350 or 25 to 32. And they are telling you that in addition to reporting it, you actually have to send an official score report because not all colleges at this point in the application require an official score report. I know it gets very confusing, who wants what. But anyway, let's say you say, I don't want my SAT or ACT scores sent to Hofstra, which is not a school that I would consider very competitive. Great school, Long Island, but it's not uber competitive. Guess what? I now have to explain my decision. And I only have to explain it if I'm applying without test scores. Like, can I say, well, your test optional, so I just decided not to take the school, not to take the test. Do I really want to say I took the SAT 4 times and I just didn't get a high enough score? I don't really like admitting that either. Maybe I could skirt around it a little bit by saying that I felt that my 4 years of high school academics coupled with my extracurricular commitment was more reflective of me than my test scores. That certainly sounds a lot better. But I also wonder, like, what is Hofstra looking for when they're telling me that my essay could be, my explanation could be up to 800 words? So I don't think they're looking for that. That's longer than your personal statement. But there are other colleges that also will ask this question on Common App. Anyway, think about how you might answer it. My best advice, in all honesty, is that if you live in an area where you can easily take a test, where you do not feel that you are at risk from a health perspective, I would definitely take the SAT and or the ACT, but I would be incredibly thoughtful about where I'm going to submit that score. And I'm going to practice sort of that differential test score reporting. I'm going to send my scores to some schools, but not to others, and hope that the other parts of my application are strong enough to get me in. So I thought it would help to just go over a testing calendar. I'm going to do it for seniors and for juniors. So I know that we've already passed that September date, but I think it's just important to know that, testing does begin at pretty much the beginning of the school year. And it is not too late for a senior who still needs a higher score to take the October or December test. Once we get into second semester, it's too late to make most deadlines other than a college that has rolling admission. So for example, University of Central Florida has rolling admission. Now, do they want you to wait until April or June to take the test? No. But if you haven't gotten in, if you've gotten deferred and you're still trying to get in, then certainly you can put off taking that test or take that test again and again until you get a high enough score and before they fill their class. And your scores do come back about 10 days after you take the test. There are 3 dates here that are asterisked because those are dates on which ACT offers something called the Test Information Release, that if you pay additional for it, you can get back a copy of the test, your answers, the correct answers, and it's a wonderful learning opportunity. Not so much for seniors because they should pretty much be done, but certainly for younger students who are taking the ACT. And if you're going to take the SAT, again, there's a very early, school year date, but there are upcoming dates that you can still take the SAT if you need a higher score. Again, second semester dates will make rolling decisions. By the way, all of these second semester dates are going to make bright futures. And we don't know yet whether the Florida Board of Governors that oversees all 12 of our state universities, what they're going to say about the deadline for taking an SAT or ACT for bright futures. I can tell you that for kids who are currently freshmen in college, if they have not yet qualified for bright futures because of a test score, they can actually still take an SAT or an ACT, yes, while they're freshmen in college, all the way through December. So the Board of Governors extended the deadline for the current college freshmen all the way to the end of the calendar year. I don't know if they're going to do it for next year. They have not announced that, but it's a distinct possibility. And it does take about 2 weeks to get your scores back from SAT. Now, for those of you who are juniors, and by the way, we don't know what's going to happen with college admission that year, what's going to happen with COVID. Will it be as competitive as it is now? Maybe. Your guess is probably as good as mine. But if you are a junior, I would strongly urge you to take the December ACT because you'll probably be taking the October PSAT, which is just a shorter, easier version of the SAT. Both that test and the December ACT both come back to you with, scores come back in December. And so you can compare your ACT performance to your PSAT performance, even though ACT is harder than PSAT. And you can decide at that point which you're likely to do better on and focus all the rest of your preparation for either SAT or ACT and not for both. And don't fret over the fact that, what if I really do terrible on the ACT? I'm going to have this bad score on my record. Well, guess what? ACT lets you remove scores from your record. It's right on their website. They tell you exactly how to get it done. There's, a letter that you have to send to ACT with certain information, and you can permanently remove a test score from your ACT file. If you go to a Palm Beach County public school, you'll have to get that score also taken off your transcript, and your counselor can make those arrangements for you. And if she or he is not sure how to do it, you can go directly to the school board and ask to speak to someone who can help you with that. And of course, juniors, you can take the test, the ACT, all the way through your junior year. You can take it over the summer. You can even test again through first semester of senior year. The goal is, let's finish up junior year if we can, because you'll have enough other things to do senior year. And if you're going to take the SAT, my strong suggestion is to please wait until March or May of your junior year. Yes, you could have taken it in August, but only if you had all summer to really prepare for it. So maybe for a sophomore, thinking about that now. And also if you had completed both Algebra 2 and Geometry, because that's, the SAT is largely Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, very little Geometry, very little Trigonometry, like a handful of questions. But truly, for juniors, take your PSAT in October. Those scores come back in December. You get full access to your test, either because your school gave it back to you, or because you went online and you have the code and you can go in and you can get access to all the questions online. And you can see why, what mistakes you made and figure out why you made them and how you can avoid them in the future. So I'd rather learn from my PSAT and then take the SAT in March or May. And it still gives me the opportunity to prepare for it, December, January, February, all the way through. And again, you can test again, to the end of the school year, through the summer and into your senior year if you need to. And again, for Florida's Bright Futures, if you are a college freshman, you can test all the way through the end of the calendar year. But again, we don't know if that will be true for the kids who are currently high school seniors. So there was some really interesting news that came out with the U.S. News Report yesterday. U.S. News and World Report once a year comes out with national rankings, and many colleges poo-poo them and say they're not important. Just because I'm ranked number 17 doesn't mean I'm better than number 24. It's not really based on the quality of the academics. And while much of that may be true, people still do use U.S. News and World Report to help shape a college list. But the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is an incredibly well-respected periodical dealing strictly with college level education, did some research, and they checked the strategic plans on the websites of 100 of our nation's largest public universities to see how many of them have strategic plans or goals that are tied to the rankings. And it turned out that a whopping 25% of them actually mention them, and some of them even mention U.S. News by name. So, look at, Florida International. Basically, it's right there in print. It says, FIU's reputation will grow, and we will move up in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Washington State University, University of Houston. These are colleges at different levels of selectivity. But look, their goal at the University of Houston is to rank among the top 75 and then the top 50. So Clemson's a popular college for kids in Florida. Their goal is to be one of the nation's top 20 public universities. Oklahoma State, same thing. And they're not just doing it on an overall basis, because U.S. News also ranks things like, engineering and business. And actually this year they have a new ranking for nursing. But their goal is to reach, high levels in architecture and, engineering. So we live with the rankings. We are in a rankings conscious world, and rankings do matter. And UF, this is our, considered one of our flagship state universities. They completely obsess over the rankings. This was in the paper yesterday. They must have been forewarned because it looks like they were all ready for this. But they are the number 5 state university in the whole country. By the way, they're tied, I believe, for number 5. And trust me, I'm not poo-pooing this at all. I think it's pretty wonderful that, here we are in Florida, and we have one of the 5 top state universities in the country, but it does show you how important rankings are to colleges and that their goals are so tied up with the rankings. So something that you need to know about how the rankings are calculated. There is a whole methodology to it, and I have the link to the methodology on the bottom of the screen. But the SAT and ACT scores of enrolled students are included in terms of the ranking calculation, and that the mid 50% scores really count. They contribute 5% towards a college's rank, and that can be pretty significant. But if a college enrolls fewer than half of its freshmen without scores, they're penalized. They're not going to get that full 5% for their scores. They're going to get less. So for those colleges who have set goals of raising their rank in U.S. News and World Report, I think the underlying message is, among other things, they'd like to see scores. So in fact, I'd like you to consider all these factors together. So last year, less than half the students submitted scores at all. I remember they didn't submit to all their colleges. Many of them submitted just to some. That these test scores count about 5% towards a college's rank, but remember they're penalized if fewer than half their enrolled freshmen have submitted scores. And that the rank plays an important role, in a college's strategic plan, in its goal, in its 5-year goal, its 10-year goal. And that last year, chances were better for admission at a number of colleges. I'm not saying don't extrapolate and say, all colleges, the chances are better. That's not the case. But at many colleges, it appeared that the chances were better if you submitted scores. So if you put all these things together, it really does make a very strong case for taking the test and submitting when or where appropriate. Testing just isn't going away. This is a quote from a year or so ago from, Yale University, Jeremiah Quinlan, Dean of Admission at Yale. And he specifically said that these tests are predictive of Yale performance. So Yale is test optional right now. But I think as the pandemic weans, which hopefully it will soon, they maybe will put back the requirement for testing. And Rick Clark, and he said this last year when he's director of admission of Georgia Tech, and he said this last year while they were still test optional, but it's basically saying, hey, when it comes to continuing the test optional mode, post-pandemic, don't count on the South. We're not going to continue it. And clearly they didn't continue it this year. So personally, I think it's highly unlikely that testing is going away. And in fact, most of last year's test optional colleges remain that way this year. And so therefore, strong scores are a plus factor in the face of the test optional. But then the question comes up, okay, I don't have scores. I tried my best. I tried. I still couldn't get the scores I needed for my dream college. What happens? Well, think about it this way. Let's just say that you have, let's say a chair that might have 6 legs, and you take one away and you're sitting down on that chair. Well, the other 5 legs now have to work a little bit harder to support the weight of the person sitting in the chair. Let's hope the person isn't too big. But anyway, so when you take away one of the really important factors, test scores, other factors all have to carry more weight. I think the one that will carry the most weight now is going to be your academic record. And it's not just your GPA. It's the courses that you've taken. How much have you challenged yourself? Did you take a science senior year? Even though you've already fulfilled your science requirement for graduation and you plan to never take another science course again in your life because you hate it, you still should have a science your senior year. And if you're applying to I'd say highly selective university, not necessarily the elites, but a university where only say 25% or fewer get in, I'd say you better have biology, chemistry, and physics. They don't care as much about something like environmental science. I mean, yes, if you plan to major in environmental science or something related to it, definitely you want to take it. But they're looking for kids who have science all 4 years. Colleges are looking for kids who have math all 4 years. That's not the same as having 4 years of math, because many of you have had, let's say, a year of algebra, maybe even a year of geometry in middle school. But colleges want to see you take math, increasingly more difficult math, all the way through your senior year. While 2 years of a foreign language may be the minimum, I know that at FSU, the average kid who got into FSU really had 4 years of math. Of foreign language. So your academic record, the strength of your curriculum, and especially your senior year courses are going to be incredibly more important than they ever were before. Your extracurricular engagement, they'll be looking more deeply. Colleges are going to make sure that, it looks like you've had some pretty deep commitment, that you've taken some leadership, that perhaps you've shown some entrepreneurial abilities by starting something, that your extracurriculars can support your choice of major if you have chosen a major. So they are going to be looking for a greater depth of commitment in extracurricular engagement. Your essays will be weightier as well. They're going to be looking for, let's say, stronger, more reflective essays, better written essays, essays that show that you really know yourself, and you've told a really interesting story, but what's the conclusion? What's the moving forward? How has my perspective changed? What's made me different? How have I been impacted by the story I told? What have you as a college learned from me? Have you learned about, perhaps my resilience? Recommendations will matter more. You're going to want more anecdotal recommendations. Teachers who will not just say something like, Judy is the math student I've waited all my life for. I mean, I would have hoped they said that about me, but my teacher is going to go into more detail and say, something like, Judy's approach to solving Fermat's last theorem, was truly remarkable. It gave her such courage for getting up in front of the class and taking their challenging questions and justifying her approach, even though it was so unconventional. And perhaps it's also going into detail about my helping other students, or my coming in not just for extra help, but to learn more about some new concept that has just been introduced. I'm fascinated by the volume under a curve in my calculus class, and I've come in to discuss applications of it, with my teacher. It's great for brownie points, but also great for, recommendations. And so you want anecdotal recommendations that will tell a story about you. There'll be, I think, more emphasis on, your context. Where are you coming from? The school, the neighborhood, the family. What are your demographics? I think that's going to matter even more without scores. So what can you do to improve your chances? Well, clearly you need to have an application that really sparkles. So some kind of a hook. Perhaps there's, a storyline, there's something cohesive that holds your whole application together, but there's some kind of a hook that when they're done reading that application, they're going to say, wow, she's really an awesome math nerd, or something like that. And I'm using that term positively because that's a description of me. So that your whole application is going to sort of gel together, and things about my potential major and the courses I've really excelled in and my interests, much of it hangs together. And that the recommenders, if I'm applying as a math major, I have certainly asked my math teacher for a recommendation, and perhaps my English teacher as well, the complete antithesis. And also because English teachers tend to write really well. Colleges are going to be looking for evidence of how you're going to contribute to the campus culture once you get there. And of course, if you're submitting your scores that are, that speak positively of where you are relative to the range, again, some exceptions, but if my scores are in the top of the range or above the range, that can only help. And I think it's very important to remember that, colleges are, who are they looking for? They don't want the kid who's just, marking time in the classroom. They really want the engaged learner, someone who's involved, in school and community, and is really going to make a difference. And kids who during COVID-19 actually did things, didn't just say, oh, there's nothing to do. I can't play soccer. There's no debate tournaments. Plenty of kids found things to do online, ways in which to help their community. And so colleges are really looking more than ever, I think, for resilience. Kids who just keep on trying, kids who have grit, they're not giving up. So we're drawing to the end of my presentation, and I'm just like to end with, suggesting that if you need some college admission guidance for any part of this process, whether you're a ninth grader or a 12th grader, these are all the different things that we can help you with and guide you and build your confidence. And in fact, if talking to parents of students with whom we've worked over the years, they pretty much all agree that we take the stress out of the college planning for their whole family, not just for their child. And sometimes parents have more stress than kids. And we really do give our students an edge because we're making the kinds of recommendations of things that they can do to not just appease the college admission gods, but to really enrich their lives academically and extracurricularly. So if you enjoyed this webinar and you'd like to learn, even more about college admissions, we've got at least 3. There's a lot more than that, but I chose to highlight, 3 webinars that we've done that you can find on our website. And in fact, Florida's dozen I just presented last week. It was, all the latest data about all 12 of our state universities and what it takes to get in. And certainly if you're struggling with writing either your personal statement or the very popular Why This College essay, we've done a webinar on that, giving you all the best tips for writing a great essay, including my reading aloud about a half a dozen essays that really worked and got kids into their top choice colleges. And we do have another webinar that's coming up next week where we'll be talking about, how do you stand out? Specifically, what can you do to stand out in college admissions and, gain that edge in order to get in? So, we hope you'll get in touch with us for anything related to college or academics. Call us, email us, whatever is convenient. And let me just find out if there are any questions.
There was just one question from earlier. I wanted to know about the role of the essay.
Okay, so I may have already answered this. The question was, what role does the essay play? Before colleges went test optional, I would say that the most important factors in college admission were academic record, absolutely number 1. Test scores, clearly number 2. Extracurricular engagement, number 3. But very close on its tail are your college application essays, as number 4. And I do think that your extracurricular commitment does play a bigger role than your essay because your extracurricular commitment does reflect 4 years of what you've been doing and who you are. Although your essay is certainly one of the most personal, revealing statements where a college can get to know you. So the essay is definitely a very key piece. Things like your recommendations, come afterwards. And by the way, you are evaluated, in context. In other words, I'm not going to be compared, let's say, to a student from a completely different school. I'm going to be evaluated against students who are in my own school or perhaps similar schools. I'm not going to be dinged because I didn't take 12 AP courses if my high school only offers 4, but I've taken all 4 of them. Okay. Any other questions come in?
Should you concentrate on the test you scored better on?
Should you concentrate on the test in which you scored better? And my answer is definitely yes. So for example, if you're going to figure out SAT versus ACT, which one is better for you, by taking the December ACT, if you're a junior, and you're taking the October PSAT, You'll be able to compare your results. Remember, PSAT, shorter, easier version of the SAT, and which I liked better. And whichever one that is, that's what I want to focus my energy on. If I have, say, a limited budget for prep, either in terms of time or money, I don't want to divide it between two different tests. I'd rather focus on the one that I feel I can do better on. There are other ways to figure out which is your better test. I believe one of the downloads that you can get is something that we put together that shows the primary differences and similarities between SAT and ACT. So sometimes just reading that, like for instance, it tells you that if you, ACT is a much more speeded test, basically means you have to work more quickly because there are more questions in the same amount of time on the ACT than there are on the SAT. So if I'm the type of student who likes to sort of, go really, really fast, that's going to be great. If I'm the more deep thinker that really needs to ponder, then I'm going to want the SAT. And by the way, the ACT doesn't require as much deep thinking, which is why I can move more quickly. Also, our learning centers score at the top. We provide free simulations on Saturday mornings. You can sign up on our website for an SAT simulation or an ACT simulation. You can take them virtually, timed, proctored. We'll do a great job scoring and analyzing. So you'll see your strengths and your weaknesses, and they're completely free. You don't have to be a client of ours. It's just one of our ways of giving something back, to the community that's been good to us. So if you were to go to freesimulation.com, that's our website, and you could sign up for an SAT simulation, an ACT simulation. You can even sign up for a review session to go over your test. That one's not free, but it is very, very low cost. And then finally, we do offer an SAT versus ACT assessment test that we can give you that's partial SAT, partial ACT, get it analyzed, and tell you which test is likely to be your better test. But absolutely spend your efforts on focusing either on SAT or ACT.
Does a college judge you negatively if you take the SAT too many times?
Okay, this question comes up all the time. Does a college judge you negatively if you take the SAT too many times? So for somebody has to define, what is too many times? My definition of too many times is 4. Some people say too many times is enough time for it to be counted as an extracurricular activity. Personally, I do think that there are some colleges that will ding you if you've taken the SAT, 4 or 5 times. One could say, listen, she's showing grit. She's persevering. She keeps taking that test until she can get a higher and higher score. I give her a lot of credit. I could look at the other side of the coin and say, like, come on, couldn't she have studied enough to have gotten that gain a lot sooner? Was she lazy that she just took her time and it took her, 8 months to go up instead of, 4 months? It's hard to know. I can tell you that the state universities in Florida do not care how many times you've taken the test. They really don't. You could take it 16 times. They are really just going to be looking at your strongest scores. They don't have time, to delve into it. But I do believe that other colleges, and I can't name them for you, but I definitely, if I'm applying to some very selective schools, I would prefer that a student has 2 scores to share, showing that I scored well the first time, but I wasn't pleased with it. And I worked really hard to get my score up. I spoke to a young man on the phone today who was really very, very upset that he'd gotten a 1460 when he really expected a 1560. And I said to him, are you kidding? 1460 is awesome. You're early on in your junior year. I'm not sure why you took the test already, but that's okay. You did, and you did well. But look at all the months you have to get it up another 100 points. You'll be able to do that. And colleges will love the fact that you started well above average and that you jumped right into their range, if not the top of the range. And by the way, colleges will only see the scores that you send them or what's on your transcript, although what's on your transcript is not considered official. Some colleges will ask for all of your scores, either SAT or ACT. Some will let you, select the best sets of scores and send those. But what you can't do is just send, a reading of one and a math of another. I'd have to send the two, the full sets. Now with Text Flexible, you can report just what you want on the Common App. And then if a college requires an official score report, you do have to follow whatever their policies are. But more and more colleges are telling you you don't need to file an official score report until we've accepted you and you decide to enroll. So before sending official score reports to your colleges, you really have two choices. First of all, number one, know which ones you're sending your scores to. So let's just say that there's 8 colleges that I'm sending scores to. I can either go to each of their websites to find out whether I have to send all of my scores or just my best sets, or I can say my time is too valuable. I'm just going to send all of my scores, to all of them. So, up to you to make sure that you're following the rules or over following them. Anything else, Jay?
Do you know how often a student is offered spring admission instead of summer or fall for top 10 nights at UCF?
Okay. So University of Central Florida has a program called Top 10 Nights. If you are in the top 10% of your class, you apply by a certain date. You have to meet some minimum threshold for SAT or ACT. It does mean automatic admission, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee you admission to the term for which you apply. So you could apply for fall and get admitted for summer, and it's possible that you could get admitted for spring. I don't believe that UCF even shares the data in terms of what percentage of kids were accepted for a term other than the one for which they applied. I've never seen that data, not only for UCF, but for any of our state universities that offer admission to more than one term. But what I will tell you is that more and more colleges are giving you strange admission offers. Take a college like, let's say, University of Miami. You can't apply for summer or fall. You're just applying for fall. But I believe that University of Miami might accept you not to start on the Miami campus, but to start in Washington, D.C. for the first semester. And I hope I'm not mixing it up with American, which sends you to Miami, but I think it's Miami sending you to Washington. Or, perfect example, Northeastern University, Boston. But you can be accepted to start school elsewhere. They have a special program called the IN program. FSU does the same thing. They have different pathway programs. You might be accepted to start school in Panama City or in Valencia, Spain. So colleges are sometimes accepting you to start in a term other than the one for which you applied and at a different campus for possibly 1 or 2 semesters. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay. So thanks very much. I hope you'll join us for, future webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to email at, I think we have the email address on the previous screen. Yeah, there it is. That, you can certainly email us any questions. And by the way, just right now, we are doing a college admissions boot camp. It has only just started. It's 5 sessions on 5 successive Saturdays. So we've just had 1 session, which was recorded. If anyone is looking for some low-cost, personalized college counseling, we've got 4 more sessions left. Just, email us and we can give you the intel on it, and hope that you might join us. Anyway, thanks again for joining us tonight. I look forward to connecting with you in the future. Stay well. Good night.